Hello class, this is Mr. Turner, and today we're going to be looking at a short screencast on some landmark English documents that directly influenced some of the landmark American documents that we'll talk about in class. There's three English documents that we're going to reference and look at some in particular in class, and this is going to be just a very short introduction to those documents, and then when in class you will look at the actual document some, and you'll kind of try and pull out some of these ideas that might be translated from one document in England, one of these landmark English documents, to these American documents that we'll be talking about in the next week or so. In doing this, before we start looking at these documents, we're going to look at some basic concepts of government that are going to overlap into these documents that are going to be also very important in writing what will become some of these landmark American documents. Four terms in particular that we're going to look at in this screencast, and then we'll add to these terms, to this list of terms later on, are ordered government, limited government, representative government, and rule of law. And on your note-taking guide there should be a place for you to briefly define each one of these. And they're really straightforward, very simple. Ordered government simply says that the colonists knew and saw the need for an orderly regulation of their relationships between the colonies and Great Britain, and the colonists and each other, the colonies and the citizens. The colonies really were facing, or the biggest thing they had to face was the distance the colonies had between Great Britain and the New World. The colonies are separated by the Atlantic Ocean, about a 3,000-mile journey each way. So the colonists knew that they would have to have some form of government of their own in the colonies to handle everyday affairs. There was no need, and it wouldn't be practical for them to go back and forth to England for every little problem they had, so there would have to be some type of government for them to use on a daily basis. Limited government, very important. Limited government says the English colonists had the idea that government is not all-powerful. Government must be restricted in what it may do, and the individuals have certain rights that the government cannot take away. Those are those inalienable rights that we talked about: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property. The colonists began to believe that the monarch, the kings and queens in England and Europe, did have restrictions, that they could not do whatever they wanted to do, and there were certain things that the citizens and the government wouldn't allow him or her to do. This idea just simply meant that from then on, the colonists would not simply just take whatever the king said as law, that he also had to follow the law set up by government. Representative government is the idea that government should serve the will of the people and serve the will of all the people. One of the things we'll talk about later on, and a term that you've probably heard before, is no taxation without representation. And this is just an example of the idea of representative government. The colonists later on down the road would be taxed very heavily and not given any voice to speak out against these taxes in Parliament. So the government was not representative, they felt, of their will. And finally, what's known as rule of law. Rule of law simply says that everyone, even those who govern, are subject to the law. So not only does law have its limits, it also applies to everyone. So even if you're king or queen, you can't just simply break the law whenever you wish, because the law also applies to you. So those are four concepts that we'll look at in relationship with these documents, especially while we're in class. First document we're going to look at is the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is also known as the Great Charter, and it was signed in 1215 by King John. What happened was a group of landowners and rich citizens in Great Britain and England kind of began this idea of limited government. There were certain things that the king should not be allowed to do. Some of those things included arbitrary imprisonment or imprisonment without maybe being told what you're being arrested for or what you're charged with, raising taxes without the agreement of certain citizens or groups, that the nobles had certain rights. They were born with certain rights, life, liberty, property. And this idea that they were born with these certain rights would eventually extend to all citizens. And then again, that the monarch must obey this rule of law we talked about, that even though he is the king, he is still subject to the law. This great council that helped to write the Magna Carta would later on become what's known as Parliament today, the legislative branch, the lawmaking body of Great Britain. Later another body will be added known as the House of Commons, and this would include knights and townspeople. So you had your upper house, if you want to call it that, the original Parliament, the nobles, and then later on the House of Commons, or the lower house, would be added. And this would give the two bodies, or the two houses of Parliament that we're familiar with today. So this Magna Carta, again, it was written in 1215, known as the Great Charter, and it was written between King John of England and these rich landowners, or these barons. Some of the things and rights that you might see described in there: trial by jury, due process of law, protection of life, liberty, and property. And the significance, the colonists would use this to protect against arbitrary acts by the king as well. Again, the king would not give them a trial by jury, would not give them their due process of law, would take their life and liberty and property away without due process. So, and they would later on, the colonists would later on use this document to help establish the principle that the monarch, his power was not absolute, he could not do whatever he wanted to do, and that he must also follow the law. So it directly relates to these documents that we'll be looking at later on, like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, so on. Next is the Petition of Right. So you can see there, Petition of Right, it says there, was written in 1628. So that's a great deal of time between 1215 and 1628. This time around, Parliament had become a very strong body by this time. Parliament forced King Charles I to sign the Petition of Right. He later on down the road would break this agreement, and it would lead to an English Civil War. That's a little bit off topic for us. But again, what it did, the significance of it, is that it limited the power of the monarch. The monarch was doing things that Parliament did not think he or she should be doing. He was, for example, taxing without the consent of Parliament, putting people in prison without a cause, or without telling them why they were put in prison, forcing citizens to house soldiers in their home. All these are examples of things that the king was doing that Parliament did not believe was within his power. Again, just a real quick chart outlining the significance of and what it was, signed in 1628 by King Charles. Some things that it was supposed to guarantee or protect: trial by jury, quartering of troops, cruel, unusual punishment, excessive bails and fines. And again, the significance, you'll see it throughout this document and the next one as well. It limits the king's power, limits what the monarch can do, and challenged the idea that he can do whatever he wanted to do, and challenged the idea that he didn't have to obey laws. Even though he's the king, he's subject to these same laws as Parliament and as any other British citizen would have been. At least that was the idea. That was what the document was supposed to say and protect. And lastly, the last one we're going to look at for our purposes is the English Bill of Rights, written in 1689. So a much shorter time period between the Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights. What this did was really was the hammer, or the nail in the coffin of the monarch's power. What it did was it took
the majority of the power away from the king or the monarch and put it in the hands of Parliament. So now, instead of the king being more powerful, Parliament became more powerful. The monarch could not interfere with Parliament and Parliament's decision. It ensured things like trial by jury, abolished excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment, and even though the king still had some power in 1689 when this was written, as the years passed, that power will become less and less and less until we get to where we are today, where really the monarch, the queen or the king or whatever, is really just a figurehead. They have no more power anymore. All the power lies with Parliament. Again, a chart very similar to the other two we looked at. This one thing I left out was who was involved in this. So Parliament, the British lawmaking body, forced King William and Queen Mary to agree to the terms of the English Bill of Rights. And what's not really discussed there is that the English Bill of Rights takes place during something known as the Glorious Revolution. The reason this is talked about as the Glorious Revolution is that it was really a transfer of power to King William and Queen Mary, but it was not a transfer of power like you're used to seeing during these time periods. It was a bloodless revolution. That's why it's called the Glorious Revolution, because there was very little fighting, very little life lost. The way it worked was Parliament went outside of England and found King William and Queen Mary to come in and become King and Queen of England. In exchange for that, they had to give up or they had to agree to sign this English Bill of Rights, giving the citizens of England and Parliament the right to petition, trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishment, no excessive bails or fines, elections. It's also known as the Declaration of Rights, and again, it was written to prevent the abuse of current and future monarchs, or in other words, to limit the power of current and future monarchs. It would become, along with these other documents, the basis for the American Bill of Rights. Parts of it would be used in the Constitution, parts in the Declaration of Independence, so that all three of these documents can really, the ideas and the rights and the protections seen in these can really be seen very easily in looking at things like the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, and we're going to do that some in class as well. So again, this is the presentation of the English Bill of Rights in the coronation of William and Mary. So this is the king, what will become King William and Queen Mary, their coronation. They're presented with the Bill of Rights and they're forced to sign it. In exchange, they become King and Queen of England. Alright, so that's the end. Like I said, very short and sweet. What you need to also make sure that you do is you've completed that note-taking guide, filled in those blanks that go along with it, and that you also take the quiz that's going to be associated with this screencast. The quiz will serve as your proof that you're watching the screencast. You know, I thought I was going to be able to set the quizzes up so that you could take it as many times as you wanted to, but I have not found that option yet. So as you're going through this quiz, make sure you take the time to look back at your notes. I pulled all 7 of these questions are straight out of the notes. So we're going to see how this works. Hopefully everybody will use their notes and they'll do really well. I can give everybody 100, or I may have to, even if you make a 70 on the quiz, turn around and give everybody 100 for trying. It's just going to be something we have to play with again. So use these notes, use your note-taking guide to answer those quiz questions. Good luck on that quiz, and we will discuss this more when I return to class. Thank you.